Okay. So chapter 13 starts off with the brain. For some folks, you may be excited about getting into some neuroanatomy, because for the next couple of weeks, that's predominantly what we're going to be covering. We're going to be talking about the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. Then we're going to be talking about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is made up of, that's the autonomic nervous system. So a lot in store, a lot of good stuff, fun stuff, exciting things. So let's start off by talking about the overall anatomy of our brain. And so we've divided the brain into, and it's important that you know the nomenclature here when I mention this, we divide the brain up into 4 regions. Okay? So we have the cerebrum, that's the largest part of the brain. When you're looking at a brain, that's usually the part that stands out. You have the diencephalon, which is an internal structure. Then we have the brain stem, and then our mini brain or little brain is called the cerebellum. And when you're looking at a brain, you probably can't help but notice that you have all these folds and these ridges and these depressions. So we give those names. So the folds, the ridges, we call that, those are gyri. And so gyri is the plural form. If you're talking about one singular one, you'd refer to it as a gyrus. Then you'll notice in between these folds and ridges are these depressions. And some are relatively shallow and some are deep. So a depression in between some of the folds and some in between some of the gyri, we call those a sulcus or sulci for if it's a plural. And then if it's really deep, we call that a fissure. All right, so just a couple terms here. And here you can see on our diagram here, right, when we're looking at the brain, you'll notice you have all these folds, and these are all the gyri here. And then you'll have the depressions in between, and those are what we call a sulcus. And in certain areas here, for example, on the side here of the cerebrum, we have a deeper one, and we call that the lateral fissure. Now, this is, again, one of those things in which I've seen it termed lateral fissure and lateral sulcus. But when we get into the anatomy in the lab, you'll see it. Both terms are acceptable, okay? But I usually gravitate more towards the fissure because it is a deeper depression. You'll see that over here between the temporal lobe and then your parietal and frontal lobes. And we'll talk about all that. But see all these different structures, some of these are going to be anatomically important when we're discussing landmarks here to the brain. Like, for example, this guy right here, which is called the central sulcus. That's an important anatomical landmark because, one, it divides the frontal lobe of the cerebrum from the parietal lobe. And we're going to talk about how the cerebrum is made up of lobes here in a moment. All right, here's a nice inferior view. You can see all these nerves coming off of the brain and the brain stem. Right, remember what I said, if a nerve is coming off of the brain, we call it a cranial nerve. If it is a nerve that comes off the spinal cord, we call it a spinal nerve. So we're going to get into all these cool terms here shortly. Nice mid-sagittal view. We can actually see some of the internal structures of the brain, primarily the diencephalon. Right, that's considered to be more of the primitive portion of our brain. So we'll get into all of that here shortly. So let's start off. We're going to go through each of the regions here. We're going to start off with the largest region, the cerebrum. And right off the gun, you need to know that in the cerebrum, this is where all our higher order or our complex intellectual functions occur. Decision-making, personality, judgment, all right, critical thinking, all of that is going to be found here in the cerebrum. And so we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. So when you're looking at the cerebrum, it's made up of 2 halves or hemispheres, okay? And so you have the right side and the left side. So we have these 2 large hemispheres, all right, divided by this, I won't call it a chasm, by this big depression there. And so and there's actually some soft tissue. We'll get into all that soon. All right, but look at all, and I won't read off the list here, but look at all of these different functions that are occurring in the cerebrum. And again, they are considered to be our complex intellectual functions. And you'll notice some have to do with thinking. Others actually have to do with certain types of sensations that you are perceiving. For example, the conscious perception of your senses, taste, smell, vision, hearing, all of that is going, all that information is going to arrive in the cerebrum. And so those certain areas of the cerebrum will then interpret that information as the perception of whatever those senses will be. When we are undergoing voluntary motor movements, so right now when I'm moving around, right, the cursor on the screen, I am using, right, it's called the primary motor cortex. I am using that, all right, in my cerebrum to control the skeletal muscles in my hands to move that cursor around. Again, that is something that occurs in the cerebrum. So we're going to go through all these different areas here of the cerebrum and kind of break it down for you. All right, so let's start off by talking about the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, cerebral hemispheres, we have two of them, all right, one on the left, one on the right. They're divided by the longitudinal fissure. And this is this huge cleft that appears in between these two hemispheres. All right, but keep in mind, these hemispheres are not completely separate from one another. There is a certain degree of separation, all right, but we have, all right, these anatomical structures called commissural fibers. And what they allow is one side of your brain to communicate to the other side of the brain. So quick review here. When we were talking about the central nervous system versus the peripheral nervous system, if you had a bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system, we would call that a nerve. Well, in the central nervous system, we call it something different. We call that a tract. Right? And a tract is made up of white matter. Well, what's white matter? That's a great question. White matter is myelinated axons. Okay, so we call myelinated axons in the central nervous system, okay, a tract. It's a bundle of axons. So in the cerebral hemispheres, okay, for the most part, they are separate, but they are connected in a few areas. And we call those commissural fibers. And the largest of the commissural fibers is the structure called the corpus callosum. And that's going to allow your right cerebral hemisphere to communicate with your left cerebral hemisphere. So we're going to go through here today and address all these different parts of the cerebral hemispheres or the cerebrum. And we're going to learn of, in certain areas of your brain, they'll have certain functions. And some of those areas may have multiple functions. Right. For the most part, we kind of have a really good idea of where certain functions would be. For example, like we know vision, right, is going to occur in the occipital lobe. Whereas we might say, well, speech is usually on the left side of your brain, but not always. It could be on the right side. All right. So we'll see how, for the most part, we have a pretty good idea where most functions are, but not all of them are going to be easily assigned to one specific region. For example, speech is one of those examples there. And you'll see what I mean here shortly. All right, so rule number one, each hemisphere, right, is going to interact with the opposite side of the body. So the example given below is the left hemisphere receives sensory signals from the right side of the body and sends motor signals to the right side of the body. And so keep that in mind. These signals are going to cross over, and we'll talk about where they cross over. Sometimes it's in the brain, sometimes it's down in the spinal cord. But for the most part, when we're dealing with our cerebral hemispheres, the cerebral hemisphere will get sensory input from the opposite side of the body, and it will send motor output to that opposite side of the body. So there's a term that we're going to talk about here shortly called cerebral lateralization. And all these functions that I was mentioning earlier, personality, decision-making, and whatnot, those higher order functions, we're going to see how those higher order functions are going to be controlled primarily by one side of the brain. And I mentioned speech earlier. Normally, for the most part, it is going to be in the left cerebral hemisphere. Okay? For the majority of the population, this is true. All right, but in a small minority of the population, speech can be in the right cerebral hemisphere. All right, but for the most part, when we're talking about these higher order functions, we will make some broad statements like, all right, that's usually going to be in the left cerebral hemisphere, the right cerebral hemisphere. We're discussing cerebral lateralization. Certain functions are going to be on one side of the brain or the other. So here we're looking at some of the cerebral hemispheres here. You've got your right and left cerebral hemisphere, right? And we've also highlighted with different colors the different lobes of the cerebrum. There's 5 lobes to the cerebrum. You have a frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and then the insula. And so we can see 3 of those lobes pictured here below. The frontal obviously is going to be in the front portion of our brain, the anterior region. And then the occipital lobe will be back here. Now, if you notice, these words should look familiar to you: frontal, parietal, occipital. Hey, there were bones named after on the skull. Had those same names. Well, guess what? The lobes of the brain are named for the cranial bone that covers that area of the brain. So obviously the frontal bone is going to cover the frontal lobe. Parietal bones will cover the parietal lobe, and then the occipital lobe will be covered by the occipital bone. All right, and same with the temporal. We just can't see it in this picture here. All right, so like I said, we have 5 lobes, 4 of which you can see. If you were to pull a brain out of a cadaver and hold it in your hands, you would be able to see 4 of those lobes visibly, right? But we have one lobe that is more internal, and we call that the insular lobe. I call it the invisible lobe, or more or less it's inside. So basically what you do is you pull the parietal bone and the temporal, the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe apart from one another, and you'll be able to peer in and see the insular lobe. And we'll show you a picture, but you cannot see it. And this is a great test question. It is not visible from the surface there. From the surface, it is not visible. All right, so let's start off with the frontal lobe. Let's talk about the actual boundaries to the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is going to be in the anterior portion of the brain, and it is going to travel all the way back to the parietal lobe. What divides the parietal lobe from the frontal lobe is that central sulcus. And I showed you that before here. You can see it right here on our superior view. Here is the central sulcus. And so anterior to the central sulcus is going to be the frontal lobe. Posterior to the central sulcus is going to be the parietal lobe. And I'll show it to you. Whoops, that's not what I want. Here you can see, here's the central sulcus on the lateral view here. So here's that nice dashed line. That's the central sulcus. So every bit of this area of the cerebrum is the anterior lobe. And then all this back here behind the central sulcus is the parietal lobe. Right? Then the frontal lobe travels all the way down towards the temporal lobe and is separated from the temporal lobe by the lateral sulcus or the lateral fissure. So in our frontal lobe, and you need to know these different functions, primarily all your higher thought processes occur there. Motor control primarily when we're talking about voluntary motor control, right? Anything that's going to affect skeletal muscles. More on that in a moment, okay? So any thought processes, that includes concentration. Me talking to you right now, I am exercising my verbal communication, right? The area of the brain, which we'll talk about in a moment, it's called Broca's area. It's in the frontal lobe, normally on the left side, okay? That's what I am using right now as I am talking to you, okay? The skeletal muscles that operate my jaw, my face, right? Even some of the tongue muscles, some of the muscles in my throat, I'm going to be utilizing to help with that verbal communication. Okay, decision-making, judgment, planning, personality, all of that are going to be found in the frontal lobe. So just posterior to the frontal lobe is our parietal lobe. So it's going to be posterior to the central sulcus. So the anterior border of the parietal lobe is that central sulcus. And so there's a gyrus right immediately behind the central sulcus. And we call that the post-central gyrus. That is important to know that, because we're going to talk about that in a moment. But we also call that the somatosensory cortex, meaning, right, all of these sensory functions that you have, touch, all right, texture, I'm trying to think what else. All those sensory functions are going to arrive in the parietal lobe, and they're specifically going to come to the post-central gyrus there. Our post-central gyrus, all right, is an important structure when we get into a lot of our general sensations, which we'll talk about here briefly. I know I keep saying that. I'm trying to build the anticipation for you folks. All right. Well, posterior to the parietal lobe is our occipital lobe. And so it is divided by the parietal occipital sulcus. So another sulcus is going to act as one of our borders here. And so that's going to be the posterior border to the parietal lobe. And then inferior to the parietal lobe is our temporal lobe. And the parietal lobe is divided from the temporal lobe by the lateral sulcus there. Speaking of the temporal lobe, okay, keep in mind the temporal lobe is going to be found just underneath the temporal bone, and that's going to be around where your ear is. So the temporal lobe, right, it's going to have two functions, hearing and smell. The hearing for me is easy to remember because your ear is right there on the temporal bone, okay? So I always think that temporal lobe right behind the ear, it's there for hearing, and then you also add smell to that. So where is that temporal lobe? Right below that lateral sulcus there. And then the last two lobes are the occipital lobe and the insula. The occipital lobe is the very posterior portion of your cerebrum there, and that has to do with vision and also visual memories. And then the invisible lobe, or the inside lobe that you can't see, is the insula. And so basically, like I said before, you're just going to kind of pry apart the lateral sulcus there, pull the temporal lobe down a little bit, pull the parietal lobe up a little bit, and you can peek in there and you'll see the insula. And its job has to do with memory and taste. So those are the 5 lobes of the cerebrum. So if I strongly urge you to just kind of memorize and learn, okay, what each lobe is going, what some of their functions are, and then you can progress on to what we call the functional areas of the cerebrum. Okay, so basically now I'm just going to talk about, right, when we go to each lobe or certain functions where you will find these functions in the brain. So we're going to start off by talking about our motor areas. And this is going to be in the frontal lobes, both left and right frontal lobes. And we're going to start off with the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex is found in the precentral gyrus. What is that? Well, let me find, there it is. Here's the precentral gyrus. This gyrus right here that is in front of our central sulcus. So how I remember that is the motor for a vehicle in the car is in the front, okay? So that's what we're gonna see here. In front of our central sulcus is our precentral gyrus, and that's also known as the primary motor cortex. So when you want to initiate some sort of movement that requires the use of skeletal muscle, it all starts there in the primary motor cortex, also known as our somatic motor area. So it controls the only muscle tissue that you can voluntarily control, and that's going to be the skeletal muscle tissue there. And it's going to always be on the opposite side of the body. So my right primary motor cortex is going to control the skeletal muscle on the left side of my body. And so there's a term for that. We call that the contralateral side, which is the opposite. And so what will happen is, right, on the right side of your frontal lobe there, the primary motor cortex in your right frontal lobe, it's going to control the skeletal muscles on the left side of your body. That means that those neurons have to cross from the right side of your body to the left side of the body. And so that is going to occur either in the brain stem or in the spinal cord. It varies, and we'll talk about some of that in another chapter. Okay, so keep that in mind. So the primary motor cortex is going to project to the contralateral side, the opposite side, right? Motor neurons to control the opposite side. So you briefly saw me show you this picture here. That is a funky looking picture. And that's basically a map, right? We call that the motor homunculus. And this is how your brain interprets how you look. And so you might be thinking, well, that's quite odd, Dr. Kaz. I mean, the proportions of the body are significantly distorted, and that's true. And the reason why that is the more area in your body that you have better motor control over, your primary motor cortex is going to dedicate or designate more real estate, more room in your primary motor cortex. So you'll notice on the picture here, for example, look how big the hand is and your face. Well, that's because you have quite a bit of motor control for the muscles in those areas there. So your primary motor cortex has designated more room, more real estate in your brain for such precise control there. So we see quite a bit there. All right, when we're talking about some of those muscle groups that are designated for precision movements. All right, so that's the primary motor cortex. Now, there's a couple other areas that I do want to talk about with motor control. We have our motor speech area. I mentioned this before. That's the Broca's area. We also have our frontal eye field and then our premotor cortex. So the motor speech area, also known as Broca's area, this again is going to be in most people, not in everybody. It's going to be in the frontal lobe, but specifically the left frontal lobe. And so every Monday and Wednesday evening between 6 to 7:20 and 7:40 to 9 o'clock, I get the opportunity to exercise and utilize my Broca's area quite a bit. All right, so as I am talking to you right now, the Broca's area in my left cerebral hemisphere in the frontal lobe there is quite active. The next is the frontal eye field. All right, now this we're going to see again in our frontal lobe here, all right, but it is going to be designated for eye movements. And when I'm talking about regulation of these eye movements, I'm talking about the fact that we're getting these eyes, the eyes to move one together, right? But also, right, you're constantly, and we don't even pay attention to this, but we are constantly shifting, especially if you're maybe reading the text on your phone or just surfing Facebook, right? You're making small precision eye movements there. And these, what we call the eye field, that's the area in which your eyes can actually move around and adjust vision to. You're constantly utilizing this when you're reading things, and the fact, all right, that we have two eyes gives us what we call binocular vision. So each eye is taking an image of whatever you're looking at, and then it gets interpreted in your brain, but they get crossed over. We'll talk more about this when we get into chapter 16 on special senses here. All right, but keep in mind that frontal eye field, those eye movements are going to be found, all right, in our motor area there in the frontal lobe there. Then we have our premotor cortex. Now this is this is what we call an association area. And association areas help to improve the ability of those primary areas. Okay, so we have our primary area, for example, the primary motor cortex, that precentral gyrus there, right? Well, the association area now helps to develop better movements. For example, like when you play the piano or an instrument, the guitar, or if you're learning how to play darts and you notice that you've gotten better, all right, playing darts after years gone by because you've practiced, well, it's the premotor cortex, this association area, that helps to refine and helps to coordinate some of these learned activities. So the premotor cortex is kind of like a memory area. So we store information, neurological information there to help improve some of these learned skill movements that you have acquired over time. Now, this is located just anterior to your primary motor cortex. So if we're looking at a picture of the brain here, it's going to be anterior to the primary motor cortex. Very similar. That's a great question. Yes, Morgan. This is like muscle memory. This is part of that muscle memory. And again, when we talk about the cerebellum, because that also has to do with precision movements, we're going to talk about all the different areas of the brain that are coordinated and actually involved in learning certain skilled movements. So yes, that premotor cortex there is going to be involved with muscle memory. Great question. Okay, so primary motor, blah, blah, blah. All right, so that's it for our motor areas. Let's talk about some of our sensory areas. And keep in consideration, we're talking about what we call functional areas. Certain areas of your cerebrum are dedicated to specific functions: taste, sight, motor activity, sensory activity. Now we're going to talk about, all right, our sensory areas here. So let's start off with the primary somatosensory cortex. This again was found in our parietal lobes, right? It is going to be specifically found in the post-central gyrus. That is going to be that gyrus that is right behind our central sulcus here. So pretty much, all right, any somatic sensory information, and that is basically any sensory information that we can consciously perceive. And if you look at the list there, proprioceptors, touch, pressure, pain, temperature receptors, all of that you can consciously perceive. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, what the heck is proprioception? All right, proprioception is going to be your body's ability to tell where certain body parts are in relation to the body. Okay, so you're thinking, well, what does that mean? Balance, equilibrium, it helps to play a role in that. Proprioception is not considered balance or equilibrium, but it helps to play a role. So for example, right, I'm standing in the anatomical position, all right, palms forward, feet flat on the ground, I'm looking straight ahead, my eyes are open. Now, if you were to say, all right, Dr. Kaz, close your eyes, and you were to gently lift one of my arms away from my body. Now, I cannot see you doing this because my eyes are closed, right? But I can feel my shoulder, my right arm, moving further away from my body. And so the reason why is because I have all these certain special sensory receptors in my glenohumeral joint and other areas too. And they're sending my brain all this information, and they're telling my brain, hey, that right arm is moving further and further away from your body. Okay, so that's what proprioception is. I'll do a much better job explaining to it as we move through the chapters. Trust me. If you don't have a really good understanding of it now, don't worry. We'll talk about it much more. So we saw in our primary motor cortex, we had a map of the body. And so we see the same thing here in our primary somatosensory cortex. We have a sensory homunculus, right? So we have that body mapping, right? And so again, it looks very different, right? How your brain thinks you look is much different than how you actually look, obviously. So again, we're seeing, all right, distorted proportions. And again, it all has to do with how much sensory information, all right, is coming from that area. So think on your body, certain areas are more sensitive than others. So they're going to appear larger on our sensory homunculus. So if you notice here, again, you can see the face and the hands are the two areas where you can see quite a lot of real estate that is being dedicated, all right, to those regions there. And that's because you have more sensory receptors there. All right, so it's primarily going to be, all right, face, lips, fingers, all right. All right, so the next sensory area I want to talk about is the somatosensory association area. All right, we saw how the primary motor cortex had its association area. Well, our somatosensory association area is going to be in close proximity to our primary somatosensory cortex. It's going to be in the gyrus right behind the post-central gyrus there. Okay, so it's going to be just behind our primary somatosensory cortex. And so this area is going to store memories of certain things. For example, okay, if I put in your hand a ball and you have never felt a ball in your life, and I put this in your hand, and your eyes are closed, of course, and I said, tell me what you feel. And so you're trying to describe it to me, but you have no idea because you've never seen this before. Now I put it in your hand and you're like, what is that? What did you put in my hand? I said, that's a ball. It's round, it's circular, it's spherical. Get a good feel on that. So as you're feeling it, you're starting to send that sensory information to your brain. So now the next day I said, all right, go ahead, close your eyes. I'm going to put something in your hand. I want you to tell me what it is. So I open up your hand and I put a Rubik's Cube in there, and you close your hand and you're like, oh, I don't know what this is. I said, okay, hold on. And I take it out of your hand and I put the ball back in your hand and I close your hand. I said, all right, tell me what you feel now. You're like, oh, this is that thing that you put in my hand yesterday. It's that spherical round structure. You called it a ball. Yes. And so that's because you stored some of that information in the somatosensory association area, and now you know what it is. And that's what we see here. The association areas are wonderful because they can help with certain memories of whatever those senses are. Speaking of which, let's talk about, all right, some of the other sensory areas here. Our primary visual cortex. This is going to be found in the occipital lobe. All right, so when you're seeing things with your eyes, obviously, it's going to receive that visual information, and it's going to store that visual information in the visual cortex. Well, we have an association area here. And so this association area is going to store a lot of those memories, and so therefore it will help us to identify things. Perfect example is, right, is when you see somebody. Happens all the time, at least to me. I don't know about with you folks, but there are times, right, when I've been teaching. Now, unfortunately, I'm not teaching on campus this semester, but in the past, when I've taught on campus, you know, I have more face-to-face interaction, right, pre-COVID, because no one was wearing masks. And so over time, you start to learn someone's face. So now you're not out on the road, on the sidewalk, or you're at a grocery store. And so when I would run into students there, right, I would be accessing that information from my visual association area, and it would tell me, oh, wait a minute, you know that person, because I would recognize the face, and hopefully I would be able to recall their name, right? But that's what we're talking about when we're dealing with these association areas. We're going to see a lot of our memories, all right, are going to be in that area there, so it can help us to identify certain things. All right, another sensory area is our primary auditory cortex. All right, that's hearing, so that's going to be with the ear. Well, what is right underneath the ear? The temporal lobe. And so the temporal lobe, same thing. It's going to receive and process that hearing, that sensory information, and it's going to store that information. And then with the help of the auditory association area, now, right, if we, like, perfect example is like a song, right? If you hear a Taylor Swift song, I don't know why she jumped into my head. All right. The first time you hear it, okay, you start to form these memories. Well, if the song is getting a lot of airtime and being played, and you're in your car quite a bit, and you hear that song 3 or 4 times a day, a week later that song comes on, you might subconsciously find yourself humming or singing along to the song, and that's because you have stored some of that auditory information into your auditory association area, and you've created memories for some of those sounds there. Then we have our primary olfactory cortex. And then again, olfaction, that is going to be for smell. That is the temporal lobe. And this is where, again, you're going to receive that sensory input when you're smelling things, and then we're going to process it, and hopefully you'll know what it is that you're smelling. And then our last sensory area is going to be our gustatory complex. That's in the that's taste. All right, so that's where we're going to have our taste information is going to transition to the insula there at the primary gustatory cortex there. All right, so those are some of the functional areas for the cerebrum when we're talking about motor function and then sensory function. And so one of the things that I really want to stress to you is sometimes, right, your brain is going to have access to multiple association areas, and it's going to integrate that information. Perfect example is if you go to a concert and you're there at this music concert and you ordered a hot dog and you're eating this hot dog, okay? So while you're there at this concert, your eyes, you see the performer on stage, right? And they're performing. So you can see them performing, you can hear the music that they're playing, okay? So visual is the occipital lobe, hearing the music, that's going to be auditory, that's going to be the temporal lobe. And then while you're eating that hot dog, you're smelling and tasting that. So you're going to be using the temporal lobe too, in addition, all right, for the smelling. And then the taste, you're going to be using the insula. So your brain is going to have to integrate all this information that's coming from many association areas in different cortices or lobes of your brain. So keep that in mind as we move through here, this chapter. I'm going to talk to you a little bit here about the prefrontal cortex here. Right? This is an important area because, right, when we talk about some of the things that are occurring in when we discuss development, for example, right? Obviously, we know when we're younger, right, our brain is developing as we age, and you see that in children, okay, through infancy, childhood, adolescence, and into young adulthood. Well, the prefrontal cortex is a lot of where your critical thinking is found, decision making, planning, judgment, personality. Well, this can still be undergoing a lot of developmental changes up until your mid-20s. I mean, I agree with this in regards to some of my decision making and judgments, Hello, sorry about that. I have no idea why that happened. Okay, I'm just going to jump right back in to what we were talking about. Apologies, many, many apologies to you. Okay. Okay, so back on what I was saying about with the prefrontal cortex. All right, this is, it's, well, one, it's going to be found in the frontal lobe. It's going to be anterior to our premotor cortex, which is the association area for our primary motor cortex. So this area is found in front of all that motor area information regions there, okay? So complex thought, judgment, personality planning, decision making, all of that is found here in the prefrontal cortex, right? So this is important that you understand, still developing, right, during adolescence, and that's adolescence can run through the teenage years to the early 20s there. So there's this one area here called Wernicke's area. Normally, again, we find it in the left hemisphere. And now this area is the area that a lot of you are using right now as you are sitting there listening to me. All right. Wernicke's area has to do with language comprehension. Most often, all right, it is going to be in the left hemisphere, more so in the parietal lobe region there. So the motor area is going, Broca's area is in the frontal lobe. Wernicke's area is going to be in the parietal lobe. Which brings me to, all right, our first clinical view of the night, autism. And how autism is a spectrum disorder, which means it varies in how severe the symptoms can be. All right, now, interesting fact, it affects 1 out of 88 children in the United States. This number has grown significantly over the past few decades because before it just often did not go diagnosed. But now we are able to diagnose it more, so you're seeing it in a higher number of children. Right? So we'll see, all right, with these children, they'll have some social and some communication issues. And again, some will just be mildly awkward, and so they just might not be able to make eye contact. And then there's some that could be more severe, in which they just can't stand still, they can't look at you, you really won't be able to have a conversation with them. So there is a certain spectrum in which we gauge, all right, the symptoms there. So obviously those that have a much more mild form, right, won't have as bad symptoms there. And so they'll be able to interact with a little bit, it won't take as much effort for them to interact with folks. All right, so we're really not quite sure as to the cause of autism. All right, now, of course, we'll go with the normal, something genetic, maybe something in the environment that the child or the mother was exposed to, possibly during pregnancy. All right, so there's a lot of information out there. I even went to a seminar not too long ago that talked about diet, and I'm not saying that somebody's diet gave them, all right, autism, but if someone with autism, all right, eats certain foods, okay, it will aggravate their autism more. All right, so really interesting seminar. All right, we'll see it 4 times higher in men than we will in women. All right, let's talk about central white matter. Well, most of you, if not all of you, should know what white matter is. We talked about this in another lab class, and I mentioned it earlier on in this class, that white matter is myelinated axons. That's what it is, straight up. Put that into your central database in your brain, myelinated axons. And so we call those myelinated axons tracts in the central nervous system, nerves in the peripheral nervous system. All right, so white matter is going to be found just below or just beneath gray matter. Gray matter is unmyelinated axons, cell bodies, and glial cells. All right, so when you're looking at a brain, you just pulled it out of the cadaver. When you're holding it in your hands, you're looking at primarily, if we're looking at the cerebrum there, that is going to be the gray matter. And then just deep to that will be our white matter. So we're going to talk about all right, these three different types of tracks of white matter. We have association tracks, commissural tracks, and projection tracks. So the association tracks are going to connect certain regions in our cerebral cortex to other regions within the same cortex, or excuse me, within the same hemisphere, which means it'll stay on the same side. All right, so we have several, all right, lobes in the cerebral hemispheres. So there's two types. You have the arcuate fibers and then the longitudinal fibers. Arcuate are going to connect neighboring gyri to one another. Our longitudinal fasciculi tracts, they're going to connect, all right, gyri from different lobes. So maybe a gyri from the frontal lobe to the occipital lobe or the temporal lobe. Arcuate will just stay within the same, I shouldn't say the same lobe, but they'll connect neighboring gyri to one another. So then we have our commissural tracts. And the commissural tracts are going to connect regions in different hemispheres. So the left side to the right side. And so we mentioned this prior, all right, a couple slides ago, we talked about the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is one of these structures that allows the right side of the brain to communicate with the left side of the brain. That's the largest commissural tract. We also have the anterior and posterior commissures. They're much smaller. So that's what this picture here is showing us. You can see how we have our association tracts. You have your arcuate fibers, and so they're just going to go from one neighboring gyri to the next. And then you have your longitudinal fasciculi fibers, and they're going to go, all right, from one lobe to another lobe. And then in the middle here, you can see we have our commissural tracts, and these are going to connect different hemispheres, the right to the left and vice versa. And so you can see here, we have the corpus callosum. This is the big, large one. Then we have just below it, the anterior commissure. The posterior is not on this picture, but it's back here. Then finally, we have the projection tracts, right? Projection tracts are going to connect parts of the cerebral cortex to other areas of the brain that are below it or inferior to it, or to the spinal cord. All right, so we have our cerebral cortex. And when we're talking about the cerebral cortex, we're mainly talking about the gray matter. All right, so the cerebral cortex, let's say the primary motor cortex, right? You want to start to initiate some sort of movement, right? So these projection tracts are going to travel from the frontal lobe, right, down through the brainstem and then eventually out into the spinal cord. So it's these tracts that are going to connect all those areas. And we'll talk about these later on, but we give them a name. And it actually tells you, the name tells you from where it's coming from and to where it's going to. So the cortico is referring to the cerebral cortex, and then spinal is where it's going into the spinal cord there. And we'll talk more about that later on. So that's what this picture is showing you. The green tracts are representing the projection tracts. And you can see, right, they're starting up here in the cerebral cortex and then descending down into the brain stem and then eventually down here into the spinal cord. All right, pedilia's interesting fact about a pedilia is just a protrusion, right, of one of the lobes, further anteriorly or posteriorly, depending on which lobe we're talking about, compared to the other side. So this picture here is showing us, all right, for a right-handed person, they have a right frontal pedilia in which the right frontal lobe projects just a little bit more anteriorly compared to the left. And normally you'll have, all right, this phenomena here where in a right-handed person, they're going to display a right frontal pedilia and a left occipital pedilia. So for the most part, a right-handed person will exhibit this. Now, if you're a left-handed person, right, it will be the opposite. A left-handed person would have a left frontal pedilia and a right occipital pedilia. It's just an anatomical asymmetry between the lobes there. All right, I told you we were going to talk about this phenomenon here, this cerebral lateralization. So let's do it. Let's talk about cerebral lateralization. Basically, how one side of your brain, one of your hemispheres, has a specific type of specialization. And that's what we're going to see here. And so when we talk about this hemisphere specialization, we're referring to our higher order functions. All right, so with our cerebral lateralization, there's two types when we're describing, all right, what that hemisphere is like. We have a categorical hemisphere and a representational hemisphere. I think of the categorical hemisphere like, I don't want to say like a math nerd, but somebody that's more analytical. All right, so this hemisphere is where you're going to see a lot more of your language abilities and functions. Like I was just saying, language comprehension and speech. Right? We'll also see categorization and analysis. Again, not critical thinking so much, but just analyzing. So the left hemisphere predominantly is going to be the categorical hemisphere for most people, not for everybody. So we have our Wernicke's area, and that's our language comprehension. That was that area I was telling you about that was in the parietal lobe. And then we have our motor speech area. That's Broca's area. That's the area that I'm using right now as I'm talking to you. So normally the categorical hemisphere will be the left hemisphere. That means the right hemisphere is going to be the representational hemisphere. I think of that as more of like the artistic or musical creative person. Right, visual spatial relationships, imagination. And then when you're comparing senses to one another, right, we're going to see that in the representational. But the nice thing is because we have these commissural fibers, right, we have the corpus callosum, we have the anterior and posterior commissures, right, these two hemispheres can communicate with one another. So it doesn't really matter if your representational hemisphere is the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere. We have those commissural fibers that can communicate either or. So we start to see cerebral lateralization occur between 5 to 6 years of ages. And we'll see with women, all right, you have a larger posterior component to the corpus callosum. So there's more connections. So, we joke around and say women are more in touch with themselves or they're just, higher order thinkers. But it's actually really true when it comes to this, when we're talking about that lateralization, because if you damage, all right, a certain hemisphere, like say you fall off your bike, you weren't wearing a helmet and you struck your head and you hurt, all right, say your right hemisphere, all right, you can impact some of those visual spatial relationships, creativity, imagination, all right. Men will suffer that much more of a functional loss because we lack more connections than women. So we found out, all right, through experimentation, studies and whatnot, that lateralization correlates to if you're a right-handed person or if you're a left-handed person. All right, and most folks, like myself, I'm a right-hander, right? The left cerebral hemisphere will be the categorical hemisphere. That's that speech dominant hemisphere. All right. But when it comes to a left-handed person, all right, all bets are off. It can be either or. Okay. Your categorical hemisphere could be either the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere. It's a 50-50 shot. But if you're a right-handed person, pretty much your left cerebral hemisphere is going to be the categorical hemisphere, and your right cerebral hemisphere will be the representational. But if you're left-handed, it's either or. So you can see here on this drawing, all right, when we're talking about, we'll go with the right-handed person, the right hemisphere is going to be that representational one. This is going to be like the creative side, right? And then on the left side over here, that's our categorical hemisphere. Here's that Broca's area, the motor speech area. And then back here, you've got your Wernicke's area. That's going to be for your language comprehension. Right? So that primarily in a right-handed person, this is what we're going to see. The right is going to be the representational, the left is going to be the categorical. But if you're left-handed, it don't matter, either or, which brings us to our second clinical view, all right, and that is epilepsy. Neurological disorder. I don't know if anybody knows anybody with epilepsy. I have a family member with epilepsy. They hadn't had a seizure for 20 plus years. And then they had one that put them in the hospital. They're okay. But it's a neurological disorder. And it's almost like a short circuit. All right, the neurons in the central nervous system up in the brain there in the cerebrum are just blasting off action potentials a lot and in a high rate of frequency. So they're just shooting off action potentials. And so now we have developed some wonderful, wonderful drugs that will help to dampen, all right, the transmission of those action potentials. But in some cases, all right, in some more severe cases, we have to remove, all right, a part of the brain, and that is going to require, and it really depends on how bad it is, all right, the removal of a certain area there. It can require the removal of a complete hemisphere. That's very extreme, though. The good news is that the other hemisphere can take over some of those lost functions. It doesn't necessarily mean that you'll gain everything back, but it can take over some, right? Not all. That's a pretty extreme case if they have to remove a whole hemisphere or even a significant portion of one of the lobes there. The other item that I'd like to talk about is a stroke, our cerebral vascular accident, or CVA. All right. A stroke is pretty much going to be a reduction or a complete occlusion of the blood supply to a specific part of the brain. And a lot of the symptoms from a stroke are really, will tell you what part of the brain that was affected. Now, that reduced blood supply could be either because we have completely blocked, all right, one of the arteries in the brain, or maybe there's a tear, an aneurysm or hemorrhage, and so you're bleeding out into the tissue there. But we learned this back in chapter 5, if we cannot give nutrients, mainly blood, to tissues, they will die, tissue necrosis. And we'll see that here in our brain. I've heard different numbers, okay? Especially I've taken plenty of CPR courses, and 6 always stands out. But I tell folks anywhere between 3 to 6 minutes, you can get severe damage to the brain tissue there if they don't have a blood supply. So depending on where this occurs, right, where this stroke occurs, will determine what type of symptoms that you have. All right, blurred vision. Okay, we're thinking, all right, maybe the posterior area there in the occipital lobe there. All right, headaches usually are going to be a symptom that people will start to describe. And if you ever hear somebody say, man, this is the worst headache of my life, you need to get them to a hospital. All right, that is not a good thing. Okay, so headaches are usually an early on symptom, right? Again, dizziness, depending on what part of the brain is affected, if it's hitting the primary motor cortex, they can have issues with walking or muscle weakness there. All right, we're going to see the symptoms on the opposite side of the body. So if you see like their mouth start to droop in the corner on the right side, then their stroke is going to be on the left side of their brain. Some of you may have heard of transient ischemic attacks, or TIAs. They're often considered to be what we call mini strokes. All right, so they're a brief episode. So you might get a vascular spasm in which the blood vessels there, the arteries start to spasm, and it disrupts the blood flow, all right, to those tissues, and they'll get that TIA or that mini stroke going on. All right, that's it for the cerebrum. We have some time here, and I'd like to move on to the diencephalon. The diencephalon is the second region of the brain. You cannot see it from the outside. All right, so there are 3 parts to the diencephalon. You've got your epithalamus, the thalamus, and then the hypothalamus. So we're going to walk through all of these, and hopefully we'll be able to go through every single one. The epithalamus is made up of 2 parts, the pineal gland and the habenular nuclei. So if we look at this picture here, all right, everything that's outlined in blue is the diencephalon. But what this picture isn't showing you is that there's a chamber here, a space, and you have spaces in your brain. And these spaces are filled with cerebral spinal fluid. We'll talk about that. But that cerebral spinal fluid circulates within these chambers, and we call those ventricles. So the diencephalon pretty much surrounds what we call the third ventricle. So that's this big space that you're seeing here. So we're going to start off and talk about the epithalamus. And the epithalamus, right, it makes up this posterior portion or the roof here of the third ventricle. Right? So there's two parts to it, the pineal gland and the habenular nuclei. The pineal gland is an endocrine gland. That means it's a gland that does not have a duct. So it has to release its secretion into the interstitial fluid or directly into the bloodstream. So this gland secretes melatonin. Melatonin is a great drug to give to your kids when you want them to go to bed. No, I'm kidding. Actually, melatonin is a hormone that helps us to regulate our circadian rhythms, our sleep-wake cycles. And so we've made the supplemental melatonin in which you can give to people that have issues trying to fall asleep. It can be helpful, right? There are studies out there, though, that are pointing in the direction that melatonin may, if you're giving it to kids pre-puberty or during puberty, it might stunt their growth. Again, not 100%, but there is some study information out there on that. But that's the pineal gland. Secretes melatonin, helps with your sleep-wake cycle, the circadian rhythms. The habenular nuclei, in case you forgot what a nuclei is, yes, it's the control center of a cell, but we also have stated when we're talking about the central nervous system, a nuclei is a clustering of cell bodies. Okay, in the central nervous system, it's where you see a whole bunch of cell bodies. And so usually when you see a clustering of cell bodies, that's where you're going to see synapses. And so when we think of synapses, we're going to think of relay places, or we're going to relay nerve signals. So the habenular nuclei is going to be this area which we're going to relay signals from the limbic system. That's the emotional system. We'll talk more about that later, not today, right? To the midbrain. That is a part of your brain called the brainstem. The midbrain is one of three parts of your brainstem. And basically, the habenular nuclei is going to play a role in visceral and emotional responses to odors. So a visceral response to an odor is you smell something and your mouth starts to salivate. That's a visceral response to an odor. How about this? You're driving in your car, the windows are rolled down, you're driving along and you smell this delicious barbecue. And it reminds you of the family reunions that you used to go to, the whole weekend long affair where everybody would wear the family shirt and you'd have a big cookout. And you remember Uncle Ernesto would come in and barbecue his famous ribs, from which the meat would fall right off the bone. And he also had his tofu there because he always respected vegetarians. And so you smell this odor, it reminds you that, and you start to get nostalgic and you start to, I'm not going to say cry, but it induces an emotional response. And that's what happens there at the habenular nuclei. All right, the second part of our diencephalon is the thalamus. Very important structure, right? The thalamus is made up of gray matter. So that's non-myelinated tissue over there. And so the thalamus is basically, I call it a football shape. It's these two oval structures that have this little connection to one another. And it looks like a football. But the thalamus is where we are going to see the processing of certain sensory information, but also we're going to see the projection of that somatosensory information to the somatosensory cortex. So you should be thinking of the thalamus as a relay center. If the thalamus relays information to the somatosensory cortex, that's when you have conscious perception of whatever it is. Okay, so that conscious perception means that the thalamus has projected that sensory information to your somatosensory cortex. So the thalamus, and I'll show you a quick picture here, there's two of them, one on the left, one on the right, is made up of about 12 nuclei. Now, you recall what a nucleus is. It's a clustering of cell bodies. That's where we're going to see synapses. So it's where one neuron is going to synapse on another neuron. And so you have this small connection between our two thalami. We call it the interthalamic adhesion, and that just connects the left and right thalamus to one another. And so once sensory information gets to the thalamus, think of the thalamus like a switchboard operator. It's going to send that information to the corresponding region for that information, meaning your thalamus, if you are actually seeing something or feeling something, for example, let's do hearing. All right, you hear something. Well, that information makes it to the thalamus, and then the thalamus says, oh, wait, all right, that's hearing, sensory information. I'm going to send it to the temporal lobe. If something comes in there for vision, it says, okay, that's visual information. I'm sending that over there to the occipital lobe. All right, so all of these sensory information for all of our conscious senses come into the thalamus. The only one that doesn't, there's an exception, all right, is olfaction. What is that? That's taste. So the thalamus is a relay center that's going to send those signals to the appropriate part of the cortex. So it's going to send hearing information to the hearing cortex. It's going to send like general touch and pressure and pain sensory information up to the primary somatosensory cortex. So it is the relay center. All right, which leads me to the last one of my favorite structures of the diencephalon, and that's the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, you'll learn a lot more about it in chapter 17, and that's in Bio 211. It is sometimes referred to as the master gland. All right, and so the hypothalamus plays, and we're going to talk about some of these functions, and you're going to see all the roles that it plays. All right, but it actually has a physical connection to the endocrine system. All right, and that physical connection is called the infundibulum, and it's this physical structure that attaches the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. Quick picture right here, that's right down here. Here's the infundibulum right there. There's the pituitary gland, and so the hypothalamus is right here. So the hypothalamus is going to make hormones, and then those hormones are going to be released on the pituitary gland, and that's going to trigger the pituitary gland to do something. So the hypothalamus plays a big role in controlling the endocrine system. So it's going to make it secrete hormones, and it's going to influence the anterior pituitary gland to secrete hormones that are going to have some effects somewhere in the body. Now, keep in mind, the hypothalamus makes two hormones, right, that it stores in the posterior pituitary gland. So this is a great question. You'll see it more so in chapter 17, but the hypothalamus makes antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. It makes it, and then it ships it off to the pituitary gland, specifically the posterior pituitary gland, and it stores it there. And then it'll trigger the posterior pituitary gland to release those hormones. So the posterior pituitary does not, I repeat, does not make antidiuretic hormone or oxytocin. The hypothalamus does. But check out this role of the hypothalamus. It controls the autonomic nervous system. We haven't talked about that yet, but the autonomic nervous system is like your autopilot. All right, its job is to pretty much keep certain functions and systems online and working, and you don't have to even think about it. Check it out. Controls heart rate, blood pressure, digestive activities, respiration, urinary tract issues, kidney function. I mean, all sorts. The autonomic nervous system and the hypothalamus controls that. That's huge. Way back in chapter 1, we talked about body temperature and how the hypothalamus, when we were learning about the negative feedback loop and all that, right? So the hypothalamus is going to play a role in cooling the body down or warming the body up. And when you are exercising or if you're outside in a cold environment. Food and water intake, all right? So the hypothalamus, right, tells you when you're thirsty and it tells you when you're hungry, right? So it's going to be monitoring, right, nutrient levels in your bloodstream. And if you're deficient, you get hungry. And hopefully you'll eat the right things. It'll also monitor the concentration of certain things that are dissolved in your bloodstream. And if it sees there's quite a large amount of dissolved substances in the bloodstream, then it says, hey, you're thirsty, you need to take more water. Drink more water and we'll dilute out those dissolved substances in your bloodstream. So it's going to regulate thirst. It also plays a role in the circadian rhythms. It's going to directly affect the pineal gland to secrete that melatonin. And then also our hypothalamus plays a role in our limbic system. Remember our limbic system, that's our emotional system, and it plays a role in some of our more primitive emotions like fear and pleasure. And so there you can see the hypothalamus. Now again, there's lots of different nuclei there. Not requiring you to know those nuclei, but I would encourage you to know these two nuclei because you'll see them again in chapter 17, right? You have the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus. You should just know those two. You'll see a role in those later on when we're talking about the production of oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone. All right, I am going to stop here. We'll catch up on our clinical view, our last clinical view for this topic here, brain disorders. But let's take a break. And next class, we'll come on back and discuss. So let's take a quick break, grab something. Whoops, I just undid that. And what we'll do is we'll meet back here for lab.